everyone, and welcome back. We're diving into something I bet you think you're already a pro at: communication.
Uh-oh. Sounds like there's a but coming.
You know me too well. But we're going deeper. Like, how to make communication really hit the mark, you
I'm
know?
all ears. Effective communication is like
Right.
essential, right?
Totally. And get this, we're using a management textbook as our guide. Don't worry, we'll keep it fun, I promise.
Okay, I was a little worried there for a second.
So, did you know managers spend like a crazy amount of their time communicating? 80%, can you believe that?
Wow, 80%. That's a lot. I guess it makes sense, though, when you think about everything they do.
Right. And there's even research, a Harvard study, I think, that found if doctors just tweaked how they talked during those shift changes, they could lower risks by 30%.
Seriously. That's wild. I mean, it shows you how much impact communication really has.
For real. Okay, so the textbook starts off with this pretty basic definition of communication: sharing info between people or groups to get to a place where everyone understands the same thing.
Sounds simple enough, but
Yeah, there's definitely a but in there.
it's that common understanding part. That's where it gets tricky. It's not just talking, it's making sure your message actually lands the way you meant it.
100%. It's like when you try to explain a project and everyone on your team walks away with completely different ideas.
Oh, I've been there. Talk about chaos.
Big time. And that's where communication really matters. When everyone's on the same page, everything just flows better, you know?
Totally. You can move faster, adapt, come up with amazing solutions.
So how do we get to that smooth communication? Well, sit down into steps. It all starts with the sender, the person with the info to share.
Right. And then there's the message itself, like the actual info.
Then they have to figure out how to explain it all so the other person gets it. That could be words, visuals, even body language.
Yeah, like how are you going to get those ideas across?
And then, of course, there's how you actually communicate, right? Like face-to-face, email, text, all those options.
And they all have their own pros and cons, in terms of how much information you can really convey.
Which makes me think, are some ways of communicating better than others? I mean, like a text message probably isn't the best way to explain a huge project.
You're so right. There's this idea of information richness, basically how much a communication method can get across to make sure everyone's on the same page.
Okay, so spill the tea. What's the most information-rich way to communicate?
Face to face. It's the winner. You get so much more than just words, tone of voice, facial expressions, body language, all those things add layers of meaning.
It's like reading a recipe versus watching someone cook it on a show. Seeing and hearing someone makes a difference.
Totally. And the other huge benefit of face to face, instant feedback. You can see if someone's confused or if they get it and adjust what you're saying right there.
That reminds me of this time I sent a text that I thought was super clear, but the person just totally misinterpreted it.
Oh no, what happened?
It turned into a whole thing. Could have avoided it with a quick phone call.
Ugh, that's the worst. Choosing the wrong way to communicate can really lead to problems.
Totally. So speaking of face-to-face, have you ever heard of management by wandering around?
Is that where managers just like roam the office?
Basically. It's when they make an effort to have those casual chats with their team, just popping in.
So it's not just about checking on employees, it's more about relationship building.
Exactly. And it's not just for managers, right? Anyone can benefit from making those connections with colleagues and teammates.
True, that personal touch can make a difference.
For sure. Okay, but let's be real. Face-to-face isn't always possible, especially these days. How do you pick the best way to communicate when you can't just chat in person?
Well, it starts with face-to-face at the top, then moves down to less information-rich options like phone calls, video calls, then emails, and even those impersonal things like reports and newsletters.
So it's like a sliding scale. Face-to-face is the most informative, and those reports are at the bottom. Makes sense.
And knowing this can help you make better choices about how you communicate. Like, would you give good news over text? Or save it for a phone call? Or maybe even an in-person meeting?
Totally depends on the news and who I'm telling. It's all about context, right?
Exactly. You have to consider the message, the relationship, and what you're trying to achieve.
This makes me think about all those times I've agonized over whether to email or just pick up the phone.
We've all been there.
Yeah.
But it's also about understanding communication networks. It's not just individual conversations.
Communication networks. Okay, I'm intrigued. What's that all about?
Think about the organizational chart, the official ways the information flows between bosses and teams, and even between people at the same level.
Right, so that's like the formal network.
Exactly. Then there's the informal network, what people call the grapevine. That's all the unofficial stuff, casual chats, gatherings, even online platforms.
Oh, the grapevine. Fast, but not always accurate. It's like that game of telephone where the message changes as it goes around.
All right, so always take it with a grain of salt. And then there's external networks. Those are connections outside your work or immediate social groups.
Interesting. So it's like expanding your communication circle.
Yep, professional groups, industry events, online communities, even just your network of friends and acquaintances.
I can see how those connections can be helpful for learning new things or even for your career. I know I get some of my best ideas from talking to people outside my usual circles. Who do you go to for advice?
Oh, that's a good question. I think we all have those key people we trust. It's like having a personal board of advisors.
Love that. And speaking of advisors, our textbook talks about these 7 key communication skills for managers. Even though we're not all managers, I think these skills apply to everyone, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. They're for anyone who wants to communicate better. Things like being clear and concise, choosing the right way to communicate, and being a good listener.
You know, we always focus on speaking well, but sometimes I think we forget how important it is to really listen.
So true. Listening is just as crucial, if not more so.
Yeah.
It's about really paying attention, being empathetic, and asking questions to make sure you understand.
It's about really trying to see things from the other person's perspective. You know, even if you don't agree, empathy is powerful.
It's like the foundation for good relationships and for working through disagreements.
Yeah,
And that's something we could all use more of.
I agree. So, we've talked about the importance of communication, the different steps and methods, navigating networks, and even some essential skills. It's like we've built this whole communication toolkit.
We have. But now comes the fun part. How do we use those tools in real-life situations?
That's a great question and a perfect segue to part 2 of our deep dive. Stay tuned.
It's like you have all the ingredients, but you still need to know how to cook.
Right.
That's where using those communication tools comes in.
Totally. I'm already feeling better equipped to handle tricky situations. So, where do we start putting all this knowledge into practice?
Well, the textbook throws us a challenge. Imagine you're leading a team and you have to deliver bad news.
Uh-oh, like what?
Budget cuts, a project getting canceled, something that's going to disappoint people. How would you approach that?
Ooh, that's tough. I think I'd want to sugarcoat things or maybe even just put off the conversation.
It's tempting, right?
Yeah.
But this is where all those tools come in. What method would you use? Email, individual meetings.
Hmm. I think individual meetings, even if it takes longer, it feels more personal and like people have space to ask questions.
That's a great instinct. Remember information richness.
Hmm.
In a situation like this, you need a method that allows for those emotions and back and forth communication.
Right. And even in those meetings, I'd have to be really careful with my tone and body language. I wouldn't want to seem like uncaring.
Exactly. Nonverbal cues are huge, especially with tough news. And empathy. Put yourself in their shoes. What are they going to be worried about? How can you acknowledge those concerns and offer support?
Wow, preparation is key, isn't it? I'd need to think through what I'm going to say, how I'm going to say it, and what support I can offer.
That's what makes a skilled communicator. Anticipating the challenges and planning ahead.
Speaking of, what about feedback? Would you ask for feedback from your team, even if it might be negative?
It's a great question. It goes back to communication being a two-way street. You want to create a space where they feel safe sharing, even if it's not all positive.
I bet that's hard, especially if you're feeling defensive about the news you're delivering.
It is.
Mm-hmm.
But feedback is a chance to clear things up, address concerns, and build trust.
You know, this is making me realize effective communication is as much about emotional intelligence as it is about the technical parts.
You're spot on. Understanding your own emotions, being aware of others, and using that awareness to guide how you communicate.
So it's not just what you say, it's how you say it and the whole emotional context.
Precisely. And it takes practice, self-awareness, and a willingness to learn.
All this talk about tough conversations makes me wonder if there are specific phrases or techniques that can help.
There are. One I find helpful is acknowledging the difficulty. Saying something like, I know this is hard news, and I want to make sure you have all the information.
Oh, that's good. It shows empathy right away.
Right. And I've also heard using I statements instead of you statements is helpful. So I understand this news might be upsetting instead of you might be upset about this.
That makes a lot of sense. Takes the blame away.
Exactly. So we've talked about tough talks, but what about everyday communication? Emails, updates, meetings, any tips for those?
Yeah, those are the ones that fill up our days.
Absolutely. One simple but effective thing is to really consider your audience and adjust your style accordingly.
Can you give an example?
Sure. If you're emailing someone who loves details, you'll include more background than if you're emailing someone who likes things brief.
Like speaking different languages almost, you need to know your audience to make sure your message gets through.
Exactly. And clear, concise language is key. Avoid jargon, use bullet points, and get to the point. People appreciate that.
Less is more, right? Sometimes we over-explain and it just muddies the waters.
And speaking of clarity, remember the feedback loop. Make it easy for people to respond, ask questions, be open to different views, and create a safe space.
And feedback isn't always about criticism, right? It's also about recognizing what's going well and celebrating successes.
Absolutely. A little positivity goes a long way.
You know, I have to admit, I get overwhelmed by how much communication we have to deal with these days. It feels never-ending.
You're not alone. Information overload is a real thing. It makes it hard to focus, process info, and even just stay calm.
It's like trying to talk in a room full of people shouting.
Perfect analogy. And that's why we need strategies. Remember the textbook mentioned filtering?
Being selective about what info we let in, right? Easier said than done.
It is. That's where critical thinking comes in. Evaluate sources, assess credibility, and spot biases. Be an information detective.
So don't just accept everything. Question it, analyze it, and form your own opinions.
Exactly. And sometimes the best thing is to disconnect. Step away from screens, silence notifications, and give your mind a break.
Hit the reset button. I know I spend way too much time on social media and email. I need more of those tech-free zones.
We all do. But it's worth it. Less stress, better focus, and you reconnect with yourself and the real world.
I'm seeing a theme here. Effective communication isn't just techniques and rules, it's self-awareness, being present, and taking care of your mental health.
You got it. And it's about recognizing communication is more than just words. It's connection, understanding, and being yourself.
It really does seem like effective communication is this, journey of constantly learning and growing, both personally and professionally, you know?
It totally is. And remember all those stats, how good communication can actually boost a company's performance.
Yeah, like it's good for business.
Well, that applies to our personal lives too. Less stress, better relationships, more success in everything we do.
So it's like leveling up in all areas of life.
Exactly. When you can communicate well, you can build those strong relationships, you handle conflicts better, and even those tough talks become easier.
It's like you're suddenly ready for anything. And that confidence carries over into everything else you do.
Like a chain reaction.
Yeah.
And the best part, anyone can learn it. It just takes practice.
Speaking of practice, any last tips for our listeners who are ready to start this communication journey?
I think the most important thing is to be mindful. Pay attention to how you communicate, notice how others react to you, and be open to feedback, even the stuff you might not want to hear.
That's a good one. We can get so caught up in our own heads, we forget to see how our communication's actually affecting the other person.
And communication isn't just about giving information, it's about connecting, understanding, and being true to yourself.
It's about creating those real connections that make life better. A deep talk with someone you love, a brainstorming session with your team, even just making someone's day with a kind word.
Those are the moments that matter, and they all come down to good communication.
So, listener, I hope this deep dive has shown you just how powerful communication can be.
It's a superpower.
Right. And remember, it's a journey. You're always learning, practicing, and getting better.
Keep going.
So go out there and try new things. Use those techniques we talked about. Be thoughtful about how you communicate. And most importantly, be kind.
Because effective communication is about more than just words. It's about connecting, being empathetic, and creating a world where everyone feels heard and understood.
I love that. On that note, we'll leave you with a final thought. As you go about your day, pay attention to the communication happening all around you.
Notice those little cues, the things people aren't saying, the energy between people.
See how others communicate, the good and the bad. And think about your own style. What works for you? What could you change?
Because the more we understand the subtleties of communication, the better we can use it to make a positive impact.
Well said. Until next time, happy communicating, everyone.